You know, after everything that went down with the Crownkeepers, I didn't really know where Critical Role Campaign 3 was going to go. So, a shopping episode that culminated with some of the most emotionally intense roleplay I have ever seen in my life? Yeah, that was a surprise, and not an unpleasant one. So, spoilers for Campaign 3 of Critical Role. If you're unaware, Laudna is quickly joining the ranks of our favorite problematic girlies here at Crispy's Tavern. Toxic ladies are our bread and butter. We may support women's rights, but we love women's wrongs. And so therefore, obviously, I am kind of excited to see where Laudna's story is going to go, even though I am sad to see this fall from grace from the lovable undead aunt to the addicted warlock obsessed with power and her patron. It's a sad story and a really compelling one. It's compelled people in a lot of ways, and I really enjoy it. However, it is notable that this is hard to do. A toxic character at a D&D table is something that we often say not to do at all because it can quickly turn really bad. And I think that while Laudna's story is not perfect by any means, it's really well done. And I think it presents an interesting character archetype that we don't often get to do at Dungeons & Dragons, and exposes some of the flaws in storytelling with tabletop role-playing games. That's not flaws in a bad way. We'll get into it, but in any case, I think there's a lot that we can learn from Marisha Ray and Laudna. And without further ado, guys, let's get into it. Okay, so what happened? We're going to be talking more generally about Dungeons & Dragons rather than Critical Role specifically, so I'll be decently vague. Basically, Laudna got killed a while back by this woman, Odahan. Odahan had the sword. One of her party members, Orim, grabbed that sword after Odahan's death, and Laudna doesn't like that. Her patron Delilah is whispering in her mind, the sword could be evil, the sword could be corrupting your friend, you need to steal the sword. And this whole situation culminated in some mini PvP. Now, for a quick aside that you can totally skip, I mean seriously, you can totally skip this bit, but I gave Abria Iyengar some crap for some rule shenanigans, and this time, Matt Mercer, it's your turn. It's your turn to be put on trial. See, the big moment of this whole PvP thing was when the darkness spell that Laudna had casted earlier dissipated, revealing Laudna's treachery to the rest of the group. But, in truth, the darkness should have been dispelled way earlier, for Laudna had casted Spider Climb, and Spider Climb also requires concentration. You have been caught, Matthew Mercer. Alright boys, lock him up. Let's go, let's go. I'm kidding. Obviously, this isn't really a video about the situation itself. I just thought that was a funny little thing. A mistake that, by the way, I would have made too because I completely forgot Spider Climb required concentration until now. But in any case, like I said, this is not really about the situation itself. It's more about the greater purpose around it. This was the culmination of Laudna's fall. She's currently an actively exploding bomb with her patron whispering in her ear. It's sad, it's tragic, and I think it works really, really well. So, what can we learn from Laudna? Well, first off, before we do anything here, I want to clarify something. I saw a lot of comments about how inconsistent this is. How can Laudna say this? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, how can she reconcile it with this character's arc or this character's arc? Why are certain characters reacting like that? What about this moment from earlier in the campaign? That moment showed they should be reacting like this. And yeah, those things may be true. There are certain degrees of hypocrisy that happened during this moment, mischaracterization. But like I've said many times, including during my last Critical Role video, D&D is not a book. And we say that often as like something to hype us up, like something to say D&D is awesome. It's not a book. You can, write this thing with your friends. But there is a flaw with D&D is not a book, and that is, you're not always going to be perfect. Like, you're going to mess up a lot. Your character's going to say things that make, zero sense sometimes. You're going to say dumb stuff that is completely out of character. And you know what? That's part of the fun. People were trying to reconcile earlier in the campaign how Ashton Greymore, Taliesin Jaffe's character, He did something that's sort of adjacent to Laudna. He tried to take some power that was essentially meant for Fern, and it almost resulted in his death in a very intense scene, and the group were very upset at him for that. Laudna is doing something sort of adjacent. She's trying to get her hands on a magic item held by another player character for her own means. And while I think the situations are different in a lot of ways, there are similarities. But there are also major differences in how the players reacted. With Ashton, they were very upset. With Laudna, they're far more sympathetic. And a lot of people were upset about that. Like, how does that make any sense? Well, sure, maybe it doesn't make sense, but, you know, they probably just forgot. You know, there are people who are playing these characters, remember? And it's not like they can, you know, go back during the writer's room meeting and change things up to make it make more sense. This is D&D. It's not a book. There is no writer's room. There are no meetings. So what I'm trying to say is this. When you're creating a plotline, any sort of plotline in D&D, it's probably going to be 10,000 times messier than whatever the hell you have in mind. Especially pertinent when you're talking about a toxic character or a character who is falling from grace like Laudna. I mean, these sort of stories, they invoke emotion. They make people feel sad or mad, and those emotions are only heightened if they feel like there's some sort of inconsistency. But frankly, those inconsistencies, they're kind of inevitable. First and foremost, it's obviously debatable that Bella's Hells are making a mistake at all. People are also inconsistent, and who knows? This story isn't over. Maybe this will be reconciled next episode. But even if it isn't, I think that that's a perfectly normal thing to happen in D&D. Do you have any idea how many times I've subtly retconned things? That would be unacceptable in a book, but in a D&D game, yeah, it's kind of just par for the course, at least for me. Like I said earlier, the entire point of this segment is this. Be realistic. Okay, before we talk about how to do toxic characters right, before we talk about anything to learn from this moment, make sure to be realistic in how you play your characters at the table. Have realistic expectations for yourself, for your dungeon master, for your fellow players. You are not a show like Critical Role. These are people who are, in my opinion, a miracle cast. They have extreme chemistry with each other. They are really good at what they do, and even they didn't play this moment entirely perfectly because it's never going to be perfect. And that's especially going to be true with just your average Joes at a table, like me, like you. So just make sure to keep that in mind. And with that being said, let's get into the first point. Okay, the first point for real, when you're trying to create some kind of character with toxic traits, broken and problematic, you gotta figure out the cause. Why are they like this? With Laudna, by this point in the campaign, we know really well why she's like this. She went through something pretty awful. She died in a terrible way, and the person that had her killed in that terrible way is now her warlock patron. Not exactly the greatest ingredients for a healthy life. And, you know, we're gonna get more into Laudna's whole life story later, even the positive aspects of it, but these negative aspects, these sad boy backstory bits, they are really important in explaining why your character are the way that they are. It is important also to make sure that you time this right. This was really pertinent in Campaign 1 of Critical Role. Percy DeRollo is a character who also has some problematic elements. You know, torture, murder, stealing souls. Not great. But when those traits start to come out in his character, we quickly learn why they are happening. The explanation is really important. Laudna is a completely different case. Laudna, for the most part throughout Critical Role Campaign 3, has been a fairly positive character. But over time, her character is being corrupted. She is changing, and in a negative way. She's been having a negative character arc, which is very different from Percy, who started out in a more negative place and went to a positive character arc. Mostly against the will of the player Tallis and Jaffe, who fully planned for Percy to have a tragic end, perhaps an end that Laudna may have herself. Before you plan out any of those ends at all, though, you need to diagnose the why, and you need to be able to communicate that to the rest of the party. Your Dungeon Master is likely going to be a major asset in this case. Work with your DM to make sure that something pops up that makes you explain your sad boy backstory, and make sure that it also feels natural. There's nothing worse than the Rebel Moon method of character backstories where everybody sits around the table and just says what's going on with them. It has to be on the DM and the player both working together to make sure that the backstory of a character is explained. In my own D&D campaign that's premiering next week, make sure to tune in on Wednesday to check it out. But anyway, in that show, I made sure early on to explore some elements of character backstory, give the players opportunities to show flashbacks or to discuss their backstories with other NPCs. Give them those opportunities so that as the show progresses, we understand who these people are. It's especially important because it's a short show. Critical Role is very different from my show. Critical Role is, one, probably better made, but also it's way longer, meaning that they have a little bit more real estate to work with. This is going to be pertinent in your campaign too. Is it a short one-shot or is it a really long campaign? Based on that, figure out how you're going to convey your backstory. Convey your why. Why the heck are you like this? Make sure to do that so that your actions make sense. Speaking of actions, that's our next bit. Actions. What the heck does your character do? This is really dangerous, by the way. When you're deciding how your toxic character is going to act toxic, you need to preface with a heck of a lot of communication, all right? You need to make sure that the other players at the table understand what you're doing. I did a whole video about playing a bully character in Dungeons & Dragons, even dressed up as Amity Blight for it because she is my favorite bully character. I am repeating myself from that video, but you need to make sure that when you are talking about the effects that your bully character has on other player characters, NPCs, etc., you need to make sure to communicate it. Some people also think, by the way, that, oh, well, I'll just make sure to exhibit my toxic traits with NPCs. They're not played by people. Yeah, they are. They're played by your dungeon master, all right? Don't torture people if your dungeon master isn't comfortable with that. They're a person too. NPCs aren't just played by some eldritch entity in the void. Your DM is there, all right? Make sure to talk to everyone at the table. This is a session 0 type thing. But with that being said, with the communication thing out of the way, it is important for you, if you want to play a character who is falling from grace or a character who has toxic traits, you gotta make sure that those, come out in some way, otherwise there's not really much of a point. Now, assuming that you've communicated, let's move on and talk about what those traits might be. These traits, these actions, they're a direct result of what happened to you, of your backstory. Laudna, for example, she feels like she needs power. She's growing addicted to her patron. She's already died twice now in pretty brutal and terrible ways, and she wants that to not happen again. That results in her trying to accumulate power, getting closer to her patron, even though that patron is one of the people who killed her. Is it entirely thought out and reasonable? No, this is a toxic character who isn't always going to be thinking clearly. Laudna's judgment has been compromised, but you can see the thread. You can see how she comes to the conclusions that she comes to as a direct result of the things that she has endured. Things that, as per our last point, the players and the audience understand. Take an example outside of Critical Role and Dungeons & Dragons, Song So Mi from Cyberpunk 2077. She is a character who had a really tragic backstory. Her main tick isn't a gathering of power like Laudna, though. Her main tick is autonomy. She's literally being turned into an object. We're going to talk about that in a second. But as a result of all of this trauma, everything that she's gone through, she feels like she is completely alone, like she has no one, and she acts accordingly. She acts like everyone is her enemy, hyper paranoid. She lies, she manipulates, and that is how her toxic traits are shown to the player character. Both of these characters are still empathetic. They both had their backstories conveyed well before they started going a little bit ham. But at the same time, they are affecting other people in a negative way. However, with Laudna, it's important to note that she's not like killing another player character. She's trying to steal an item. The PvP that was initiated was basically entirely non-lethal. It ain't killing anybody, alright? It is important to make sure that your actions don't make you into a straight-up villain. Song So Mi from Cyberpunk can go really, really crazy in that game depending on your choices, but that is a single-player video game, not a tabletop role-playing game, and Song So Mi is an NPC, not a fellow player character. Make sure that your actions reflect your backstory, and make sure to keep in mind the other people at the table when you're acting like the toxic girly you've always wanted to be. Okay, next up, appearance. This is like my favorite bit of what happened during this latest episode of Critical Role. Laudna's form of dread changed. It changed as a direct result of everything that's happening to her, and it became Delilah. That's the great tragedy of all this power hungrying that Laudna's been going on. She's turning into the person who first killed her, and her form of dread reflects that. This is kind of like a sub-point of the last bit where we were talking about actions and effects. This is also a direct effect of Laudna's trauma, but it is aesthetic. Aesthetics are a really powerful thing. Go back to Song So Mi, that character from Cyberpunk I mentioned earlier. Her whole trauma is her loss of autonomy, her loss of personhood, and her design reflects that. When you first see her in person, it's sad and horrifying, as her entire body has almost been entirely replaced with metal. She's being turned literally into an object, a direct aesthetic result of the trauma that she has endured and a constant reminder of what she is going through. Many people become ride or die for Song So Mi just based on her appearance. Appearances and aesthetics, they're a powerful thing. I mean, arguably, Laudna's transformation into Delilah at the end of the episode, that is the most pertinent part of the roleplay. I mean, so many of the comments were just talking about that moment because it was powerful. It was good. Baldur's Gate 3 also does this. Basically, all the characters have physical signs of the things that they've gone through. In Will's case, we literally see him endure an appearance change due to something traumatic going on in his life, his connection to his patron, Mizora. Appearance and aesthetic is something that can sometimes be forgotten in a game that takes place in your head, but it is very, very pertinent. Appearances, aesthetics, they can sometimes be forgotten in a game that takes place entirely in your brain space, but, I mean, they shouldn't be. They are so powerful for conveying what a character is going through. And Laudna's form of dread wasn't like visualized. We didn't see her turn into Delilah. It was just Marisha describing it. And honestly, describing it in a pretty plain way.
Describe to me how your form of dread operates.
It's just Delilah.
Powerful moment with not a lot of description, honestly, but still powerful nonetheless. It's the simplicity that made it so good. You don't need to do anything too crazy. Sometimes just a basic statement like this is enough to really hit home with your DM and with your fellow party members. But yeah, those physical scars, those changes, whether they be literal scars or metaphorical ones, they are powerful for conveying what a character is going through. Final thing, empathy. I mean, Laudna is tragic because people like her. Because we've seen her be happy, that goth aunt that everyone wants to have. We've seen her be the heart of this party. We've seen her give her heart to Imogen in a beautiful relationship. And now we're seeing her lose all of it over time. But the reason it's sad is because we've seen her be good. This doesn't work if your character isn't empathetic, right? This whole thing falls completely flat if your character is just an antagonist. I mean, yeah, we have plenty of empathetic antagonists, but a tragic hero, in my opinion, is a completely different thing to play out. Now, of course, the first point in this video needs to be kept in mind. That very first point about how it's never going to be clean. It's gonna be messy. When you're doing your character arc, when you're trying to make your character empathetic but at the same time tragic, it's gonna be hard. It's really, really, really hard to pull off an improv game. But you gotta put in that effort. You gotta put in that effort to make your character likable in some way, or at the very least, show them being vulnerable. Look at all the problematic girlies that we love here at Crispy's Tavern. I mean, the reason why, at least I love these characters so much, are moments of vulnerability. From the sit down with Song So Mi to that moment with Shadowheart where she first reveals what she's gone through. Those moments were so powerful. And they were the reason why I was cheering for these characters all the way, why I felt the tragedy of their stories. And the same thing goes for Laudna, and the same thing goes for whatever character you want to make. It could be small, little roleplay moments, during a long rest maybe, while you're taking watch with another party member, maybe you could have a heart-to-heart discussion. That's my favorite way to convey a character arc. The long rest is a powerful thing for giving free time for intimate roleplay. Not intimate like that, stop it. But seriously, when you have that space, take advantage of it. It could also be really small things in the way your character reacts to certain things. I have a cleric in my new D&D campaign, but yeah, this cleric, played by Fall Cosplay, has some issues. She's a part of an organization that may not have her best interests at heart, but she is devoted to them entirely. However, Fall Cosplay has these small little moments of doubt. Very emotional moments, and they aren't big, explosive PvP battles like what Laudna is going through right now, but they're small. They're little itty-bitty roleplay moments, but they have a big effect. Take advantage of the small stuff too. It all builds up to make your character more empathetic. Laudna has had 90-some episodes to worm her way into people's hearts before breaking all of our hearts with this descent into madness that she's currently going through. However, like I said earlier, it wouldn't hit if she didn't worm her way into our hearts first. Make sure to do that, especially if you want to do a negative character arc. All of this advice may not help you. Like I said at the top, this is a really hard to pull off. It requires a lot of roleplay skill, a lot of communication, and a lot of straight up luck from the other party members. I mean, if I were writing out Campaign 3 like a book, I would put this Laudna arc much earlier in the story. But I mean, it was triggered by the death of a villain that couldn't be reached until later on in the campaign. That villain only died because someone else sacrificed for them. Because, like I said earlier, D&D is not a book. Can't plan it all out. Sometimes it's gonna be messy. But hey, I mean, that messiness, that's what makes this fun. I was so bothered by that Crownkeeper ending from the last time I talked about Critical Role. That bothered me because they would try to treat D&D not like a book. It was a moment where the cast just tried to make something happen and it felt unnatural and forced. The messiness of what's going on right now, that's what I love from Dungeons & Dragons. And yeah, maybe it's not as clean of a story, but it is more, in my opinion, heartfelt. This stuff, it's what I love, warts and all. I hope this helped you to realize perhaps a negative character arc at your D&D table. Obviously, I'm cheering for heroes here. I love the redemption of characters like Shadowheart and Song So Mi, despite some of their toxic traits. I love those characters, and I hope that you guys have your own epic redemption arcs. And I wish the best for Laudna as well, because goodness knows, she might need it. But in any case, if you guys enjoyed this episode, you might enjoy our last episode on Critical Role where we talked about the Crownkeepers. That is linked in the cards at the end of the video. But before you go, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Crispy's Tavern to make sure you never miss a single one of our uploads as they come out. And finally, if you have your own tips or thoughts, go down in the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment toxic to let me know you made it to the end of the video. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I will see you all next time. Farewell. Okay, I've got to go to a Justin Timberlake concert, believe it or not. Seriously, I'm not even kidding. I'm actually going to a Justin Timberlake concert.